The fundamental teachings of the Buddha. First of all, let me recall a few key points of the Buddha's teaching in order to help you review your understanding. These are truly fundamental points, necessary for grasping Dhamma correctly. I emphasize the term fundamental because there exist many interpretations that are not fundamental in fact. Some are outright distortions, introducing explanations that drift further and further from the Buddha's own teaching. Even if these additions maintain a veneer of Buddhism, they are nevertheless extra and will eventually be discarded as outside the authentic Dhamma. For anything to be considered part of the Buddha's fundamental teaching, it must meet two conditions. First, it must help eliminate dukkha, suffering. Second, it must be something that anyone can verify for themselves, namely, it must lead to the ending of suffering without having to rely on anyone else. Buddhism is a path of self-reliance. These two conditions form the very foundation of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha never spoke about anything that does not serve the purpose of ending dukkha. Topics such as rebirth, for example, fall outside this purpose. One might ask the Buddha, what is rebirth? How does it operate? What are the results of karma? But none of these questions bear on the elimination of suffering. Moreover, anyone who raises such questions must then place blind faith in answers given by others, people who themselves cannot directly verify those answers, who merely repeat what they have heard or offer their own conjectures. Thus, such topics progressively drift away from the heart of Dhamma and lose all connection with its goal of ending dukkha. By contrast, if we set aside those fruitless questions, we can ask instead, does dukkha truly exist? And what must be done to end dukkha? The Buddha is eager to answer these questions, and anyone who listens to his words can come to understand their truth for themselves, without blind faith. Gradually, one's clarity deepens until, at last, one attains perfect understanding. When that understanding is complete, when it enables the permanent ending of dukkha, it is called supreme understanding or enlightenment. With supreme understanding comes the insight that even in the present moment there is no person living. There is no self that exists. One also sees without doubt that there is no I and nothing that belongs to an I. Although explaining enlightenment and liberation is simple and direct, their depth is profound to realize that there is no person at all living. And nothing whatsoever belonging to anyone, not even one's own body or mind, is the very essence of awakening and liberation. Our sense of a self and of mine arises only when we naively trust the deceptive nature of sensory experience. The experiences of the six senses do not faithfully represent reality. They are only subjective, conventional constructions, stamped by the traces of past karma. This is the deceptive character of sense experience. If there is no individual self, if no person ever comes into being, then no one ever dies, and no one ever is reborn. Thus, the idea of rebirth becomes utterly laughable and irrelevant to Buddhism. A subtle point made by Buddhadasa is that when he spoke of rebirth, he meant the rebirth of the self in our present mind stream. Tantra Buddhism, by contrast, looks directly at death in order to master it. But the central aim of Buddhism is to help us realize that there is no self, no individual entity. Our sense of a self is simply a mistaken understanding born of ignorance. In truth, there is only a body and a mind, and these are merely natural processes, mechanical movements that process and transform data. If those movements operate improperly, the result is a foolish, nonsensical understanding of reality, namely, belief in the real existence of a person and in things belonging to that person. If those processes function correctly, that mistaken perception never arises. Instead, a clear, pure awareness comes forth, satipana, truth-discerning mindfulness which sees reality directly. That is the fundamental, authentic insight, the clear realization demonstrating that there is no self and nothing belonging to a self. On this basis, one can understand that rebirth and similar topics do not belong within Buddhist teaching. Better to ask directly, is there dukkha? And how do I extinguish dukkha? When one understands the root cause of dukkha, one also discovers the method for its removal. What is that root cause? It is ignorance, believing mistakenly in the existence of a self and in mind. The question of self and of mind, the doctrine of non-self, is the core of Buddhist teaching. It must be uprooted entirely. All understanding and all practice in Buddhism focus on exactly this. I urge you to remember this well. If we examine carefully the fundamental foundation of Dhamma, we recognize that it is not overly extensive. In one discourse, the Buddha remarked that his teaching was like a handful of leaves. In the Sayutta Nikaya, he picks up a handful of Samsapa leaves in a Kosambi forest and says, "Monks, the leaves in my hand are few compared to the leaves on the trees throughout this forest. What I directly realize is far greater than what I have taught. But why do I not teach everything? Because it is not relevant to the goal, it does not dispel delusion, it does not uproot craving, it does not bring cessation, peace, direct insight, mindfulness, awakening, and liberation. That is why I do not expound it. I repeat this at length because Buddhadasa adopted this sutta as his teaching motto, to teach only what is truly necessary to help practitioners avoid getting lost and to prevent them from entering superfluous or misleading branches of learning. Therefore, as noted above, some Western scholars and even some Thai Buddhists think that Buddhadasa advocated simplifying Buddhism, and this is a mistake. The Buddha walked through a forest, bent down to pick up a handful of leaves, and asked the monks following him whether the leaves in his hand were more numerous than those on the branches of the trees in the forest. All the monks replied unanimously that the leaves on the branches far outnumbered those in his hand. Reflect on this metaphor to understand what the Buddha meant. The leaves in the forest are indeed countless. The Buddha was indicating that his direct realizations were as many as the leaves in the forest, yet what needed to be taught and practiced was no more than the handful of leaves in his hand. Although he fully perceived the nature of reality and understood the laws governing all phenomena in the universe, he chose only those insights that were most practical for directly bringing liberation to all beings. In summary, the fundamental principles necessary for practice to eliminate dukkha are no more than a handful of leaves, while countless other teachings exist in the world. We must recognize the great benefit of this scarcity, for it does not exceed our capacity to learn and absorb. This is the first crucial point we must be aware of in order to establish a solid foundation for the entirety of Buddhist teaching. I have just mentioned Buddhist teaching, and I hope you will also seek to understand precisely what these words mean. In our era today, whenever we hear Buddhist teaching, it is like a dense fog, vast and ill-defined. In the Buddhist time, a different term was used, not Buddhist teaching, it was Dhamma. Please note that the word Buddhism itself is a Western coinage from the early 19th century around 1825. The term Dhamma simply means that which puts an end to dukkha. There are many different Dhammas. The Dhamma taught by the Buddha is called the Dhamma of Gautama the monk. If it is the Dhamma of another practitioner, for example, that of Nigantha Nadapada, a contemporary of the Buddha and founder of Jainism, we call it the Dhamma of Nigantha Nadapada. Whoever prefers a particular Dhamma studies it until they fully understand it and then applies it. It was called the Dhamma of Gautama the monk in ancient times because the Dhamma was still very pure, free from snares and devoid of countless foreign additions. Today, we lump all these additions under the label Buddhist teaching. Due to our lack of care, the so-called Buddhist teaching has become a vast fog containing completely foreign elements that were never part of the original doctrine. Allow me to add a few further notes. Anyone who is a Buddhist must always be mindful of the impermanent nature of all phenomena. Dhamma itself is just a phenomenon. This is the most distinctive and unique characteristic of Buddhism. Dhamma evolves and transforms through time, space, and interaction, adapting to its surroundings to become rich and complex, including some erroneous interpretations, but that is the living force of Buddhism. This is what makes Buddhism different from religions that rely on rigid, lifeless principles. Nevertheless, Buddhadasa was completely correct in advocating a search for the most primordial, pure, and practical elements to help practitioners more effectively. The authentic teaching of Buddhism is already more than sufficient like the leaves in the forest, but what needs to be studied and practiced is only like the handful of leaves in the hand. Even today, although it is already vast, people still want to add all kinds of things to the Buddhist teaching, such as religious history or applied psychology. For example, consider the Abhidhamma, the third basket of the Tipitaka, composed after the Buddha's passing. Its content includes many sections on psychology and other parts on philosophy, and it was continually developed to meet the demands of practitioners over roughly 10 centuries from the 1st to the 11th century, until Buddhism began to decline throughout Asia. Moreover, the Abhidhamma itself consists of various texts with different content according to different schools. Therefore, far too many elements have been appended to the Buddhist teaching. All of these are collected under a single name, Buddhist teaching, yet in reality there are many different Buddhist teachings, various schools, sects, etc. If we do not discern the essential points, we will inevitably be confused in choosing a teaching that suits us. It is like entering a store that sells too many items, leaving us unsure what to choose. Usually, we simply select based on personal preference, adding a bit of this, removing a bit of that to suit our taste. But actually, that is choosing based on one's own weaknesses, catering to private preferences rather than judging according to mindfulness and awareness. For this reason, Our spiritual practice sometimes consists solely of things like ritual offerings, striving to make merit, memorizing scriptures, seeking to reduce fear through prayers or meditations aimed at escapism, and so forth. But none of these have any real connection to the Buddhist teaching. Thus, we must strive to distinguish between the authentic Buddhist teaching and the additions that have been appended. Even within the authentic teaching, we must recognize which points are the most fundamental and essential. These are what I will present to you next. Spiritual disease. These lectures are held in a hospital, which reminds me of a treatise that likens the Buddha to a physician of the mind. When studying some of the Buddha's teachings and their commentaries, one can discern certain criteria for identifying two types of disease: physical illness and mental disease. The scriptures often refer to mental disease, but their description and diagnosis differ from today's usage. In the Buddha's era, this term meant only a mistaken perception of all phenomena, or simply craving. Today, it is used to designate actual mental illnesses, diseases related to the body, including the brain, and thus to the entire realm of the physical body and brain. To clarify these terms, I propose introducing a third term. First, group together bodily diseases and mental illnesses under the term mental disease, and second, introduce the term spiritual disease, malady spirituelle, to designate what the Buddha describes as a disease of the mind. Every person may have good physical health, no bodily illness, or they may suffer from mental disease, in the modern sense insanity, psychosis, but all people are afflicted by spiritual disease, a disease caused by a mistaken perception of all phenomena, ignorance, avidya. The term mind here denotes the very subtle mental aspects that are infected, being governed by microbes of the mind, ignorance and erroneous perception of reality. Buddhist concretizes this condition as a deep-seated disease of the mind, caused by the microbes of ignorance and confusion. In Buddhism, all that we perceive of reality is entirely subjective and conventional, distorted by sense impressions colored by past karma. Although we may be physically healthy without bodily illness and not suffer from modern mental disorders, loss of reason, or psychosis, our mental processes, as reflected through intentions, speech, and actions, operate in a pathological manner. Buddhist calls this the spiritual disease of humanity, which afflicts everyone. A mind layered in ignorance and ruled by the misperception of phenomena is a mind with spiritual disease. Its perception of all phenomena is wrong. Because its perception is wrong, its thinking is wrong, its speech is wrong, and its actions are wrong. The spiritual disease lies hidden within these thoughts, words, and deeds. You can immediately see that everyone is ill with spiritual disease without exception. Physical and mental illnesses afflict only certain people at certain times, and they are not particularly dreadful. That is why Buddhist teaching does not concern itself with those bodily or mental afflictions. Also note that if meditation is regarded merely as a means to improve physical health and achieve mental balance, then it is not truly Buddhism. Meditation must serve a far loftier and deeper purpose, namely to cure the profound spiritual disease of the mind and transform each individual's mistaken perception of reality. Buddhist teaching is the remedy for spiritual disease, and the Buddha is the physician of the mind. In short, everyone suffers from spiritual disease and must be healed. Dhamma is the medicine for this. One must take that small handful of Buddhist teaching as a dose to absorb and heal the disease. You should also note that in our time, people no longer pay attention to spiritual disease, and so they continually perpetrate evil upon themselves and others. When one person suffers from spiritual disease, it infects others, and eventually the whole world falls ill. Ignorance begets ignorance, violence begets violence. The world is beset by both bodily/mental illness and spiritual disease. Consequently, instead of finding lasting peace, we endure perpetual crisis. No matter how fiercely we strive and struggle, we never find peace, not even for a moment. Sitting down to negotiate long-term peace only wastes time, because every party involved is afflicted with spiritual disease. Each believes they are right and everyone else is wrong. Even those leaders mentally healthy, highly intelligent, well-educated, wise, skilled in strategy are, from the Buddhist perspective, and in Buddhist's view, severely afflicted with spiritual disease. All factions suffer from it, and thus constantly generate more dukkha for themselves and others, as if a machine in this world is designed to manufacture suffering. How then can we bring peace to the world? By curing the spiritual disease afflicting every being. What medicine can achieve this? There must be a remedy capable of dissolving that disease. Indeed, there is. It is the handful of Dhamma leaves of Buddhist teaching, This is the essence of the Four Noble Truths. Why then has teaching ceased to be a refuge for people today, even though Buddhism is said to be more developed and its understanding more widespread than ever? No matter how thoroughly one studies and understands the teaching, if one does not realize one is afflicted with spiritual disease, one cannot grasp what the teaching is or how to apply it. If you are unaware of your illness, you will never seek a physician or take medicine. Almost no one realizes they are ill, so medicine becomes merely a fad, perhaps a deceitful show or scheme. We attend Dhamma talks and may study the Dhamma as though it were a miraculous remedy, yet we never think that we ourselves are unwell. We receive the Dhamma and then set it aside, or we use it as a topic for debate or even to attack others. That is why the Dhamma today is no longer an effective cure for the world. If we truly wish to establish a Buddhist society here and now, we must clearly define its ultimate aims. Only then can our efforts yield genuine results. In that case, the Dhamma can directly and effectively cure spiritual disease. We must identify those goals with clarity, or we will not know which direction to take. In truth, there is only a small amount of sacred nectar in the palm of the hand, but we must know how to use it correctly and effectively. We must learn to practice so that it benefits us and does not become a farce. Now let us examine what spiritual disease is and how to treat it with the handful of Dhamma leaves in our hand. The bacteria that cause spiritual disease lie hidden within the perceptions called self and mind. These perceptions constantly assail us. They reside in our minds, first appearing as feelings of self and mind, and then, under the influence of self-centeredness, transforming into greed, hatred, and erroneous perceptions of all phenomena. These conditions create turmoil for ourselves and others. Such turmoil is the symptom of spiritual disease ravaging our minds. In short, we may call spiritual disease the disease of self and mind. Everyone suffers from it and continues to acquire more of these bacteria whenever they encounter forms, smells, touches, tastes, or mistaken thoughts when the senses come into contact with environmental objects teeming with bacteria. We must realize that these bacteria give rise to two kinds of attachment to self and attachment to mind. Attachment to self means feeling that one's person truly exists. I am this or that. I am equal to, inferior to, or superior to others. These attitudes merely express the sense of a self. Attachment to mind means regarding things as belonging to oneself. This is my property. These are my views. Even what we hate we see as our enemy, our mind. Both attachments are extremely dangerous and constitute the disease called spiritual disease. All philosophical systems in the Buddha's time aimed to treat this disease. Although their methods differed, their purpose was the same: how to eliminate the perceptions of self and mind. The difference in Buddhism is that other philosophies assume that once those perceptions are removed, what remains is the true self or pure Atman, or simply desire, a form of craving. By contrast, Buddhist teaching avoids generating any new attachment to self or to things belonging to self. According to the Buddha, when one sees self and mind in their true nature, what remains is perfect emptiness called nibbana, completely empty of self and mind, as in Nibbana Paramam Sunyam. Nothing remains. Nibbana signifies the end of spiritual disease. The issue of self and mind is extremely difficult to grasp. Without deep concentration, it is hard to perceive the dukkha hidden so subtly behind self and mind, those bacteria causing spiritual disease. The term atta, also called tsai-na, corresponds to the Latin ego, meaning self. Whenever the sense of I arises, we call that egocentricity, egotism, because it naturally gives rise to the sense of mine. When the sense of I and the sense of things as mine are combined, this yields true egoism, selfishness. People often claim that the ego is an instinct present in all living beings and functions as the center of life. In English, the word ego can also mean soul, derived from the Greek kentron, meaning center. Thus, atta may be seen as the essential core of every living being. And for an ordinary person who does not practice, it is extremely difficult to uproot or escape it. In short, an unawakened person is always dominated by selfishness. In fact, this egoic tendency need not always manifest openly. It surfaces only when sense contact occurs, that is, when one sees a form, hears a sound, smells an odor, touches an object, or when a thought arises in the mind. At the moment that the sense of I or of mine appears, we may say that the symptom of the disease is fully detected, regardless of which sense organ triggered it. At the very instant of sense contact, the sense of I and mine arises, the symptoms of the disease manifest clearly, and true selfishness emerges with full force. At this stage, it is no longer mere egotism but selfishness, egoism, in the fullest sense, that is, a self-centeredness that misleads a person onto a lowly path concerned only with oneself and indifferent to others. Every action then expresses extreme selfishness. In that state, a person acts solely under the sway of craving, aversion, and confusion about the nature of phenomena. The disease manifests in the form of selfishness, causing harm to oneself and to others. This is the greatest danger in today's world. The reason the world is mired in confusion and disorder is simply that everyone is selfish, forming factions to oppose one another. They strike at each other blindly, yet inwardly they do not truly intend harm. They are driven by impulses they cannot resist. This is how the disease invades and spreads through their being. The bacteria that cause disease proliferate in the world because no one knows the remedy, even though that remedy is readily available as the core of the Buddhist teaching. What is the core of Buddhist teaching? I very much hope you will grasp what the core of Buddhist teaching truly means. In today's talk, if I were to ask, what is the core of Buddhist teaching? I would surely receive countless, contradictory answers, none the same as another. Each person would answer according to what they have learned, heard, or inferred. Look at our world today. How many can truly identify the core of Buddhist teaching? And among them, how many have applied that core effectively? If asked what the heart of Buddhism is, some will say the Four Noble Truths. Others will recite Anakkam Dukkha Anatta, the three marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, or unsatisfactoriness, non-self. Still others will recite Sabba Papassa Akara, Kusalasa Upasampada, Sasiddha Pariyodapana, Ada Badana Sana, do no evil, cultivate good, purify the mind. This is the teacher's teaching. All these answers are correct, but only in part because people answer by rote and forget to verify for themselves whether it is truly so. To state the core of the Buddha's teaching, I simply recall one extremely concise declaration of the Buddha: Sab Dhamman Lyabhanavesya, one must not cling to anything. In the Majjhima Nikaya, it is recorded that once a person approached the Buddha and requested that he summarize his teaching in a single, very brief statement. The Buddha replied that he could do so, and he spoke these words: Sab Dhamman Lyabhanavesya, one must not cling to anything, Sab Dhamma, anything at all, La, not allowed, Abhanavesya, clinging. The Buddha then emphasized its importance by adding that anyone who hears this core teaching has heard the entire teaching, and anyone who realizes its fruit has realized all the fruits of his teaching. If one perfectly and absolutely understands this truth, not to cling to anything, one is freed from the bacteria of craving, aversion, and ignorance that give rise to all mistaken actions of body, speech, and mind. Thus, whenever a form, sound, odor, taste, touch, or mental phenomenon arises that do not cling to anything, antibody immediately prevents infection. The bacteria cannot penetrate, or even if they do enter, they are easier to eliminate. In any case, they cannot proliferate or cause disease, because the antibody continually destroys them. Indeed, that antibody is supremely powerful and eternal. That is the core of Buddhist teaching of all Dhamma. Do not cling to anything. Whoever realizes that truth may be said to have developed the antibody that neutralizes every harmful effect of spiritual disease, bringing it to an end. They will no longer suffer under that disease. But a person who does not understand the core of the Buddha's teaching is entirely without resistance. Until one realizes one is ill, one never thinks to seek a cure or take the medicine. If you do not know you are sick, you live carefree, chasing whatever you like. That is like a person with tuberculosis or cancer who frolics without concern for treatment until it is too late, and death becomes unavoidable. Do not fall into such foolishness. Always follow the Buddha's instruction. Do not be negligent. Always be fully mindful. Only with strong mindfulness can we recognize that we are tormented by spiritual disease and thus discover the bacteria that afflict us. If you apply these instructions correctly and persistently, you will immediately experience the finest benefits that humanity can attain. Clinging is the root cause of spiritual disease. We must recognize clearly that our acts of clinging are both the bacteria that cause the disease and the means by which it spreads. Even by observing phenomena at the simplest level, we see easily that attachment to I and to mine is the most grievous wound. When I takes hold and selfishness flares, even the smallest matter can provoke anger, regret, sorrow, suffering, joy, or elation. One can classify the defilements of the mind into 3 levels: lobha, which is craving, desire, passion; dosa, which is aversion, dislike, hatred; and moha, which is ignorance, delusion, a mistaken understanding of reality. These are commonly called the 3 poisons, trivia, or the 3 forms of passion, kia. In Vietnamese sources they are known as tam, san, si. Texts sometimes subdivide these mental afflictions into 16 or more categories. Different schools enumerate them variously, but ultimately they all reduce to the 3: craving, aversion, and ignorance. On the surface, craving, aversion, and ignorance may not seem painful. We live under their influence every day. We experience pleasure in eating, we laugh and enjoy ourselves, we admire those of the opposite sex or of the same sex. We scorn our enemies as fools, and we may even feel satisfaction at their misfortune. Yet behind these cravings, hatreds, and delusions lies a vast sea of suffering of which we remain unaware, especially ignorance, which so cleverly deceives us that we do not realize its power. All 3 poisons can be seen as stemming from a single root: the sense of self and mine. That sense of self and of things as mine is the seedbed from which craving, aversion, and ignorance grow. When it manifests as craving, lobha, it draws sensory objects toward itself. When it manifests as aversion, dosa, it pushes objects away. And when it falls into confusion, uncertain whether to grasp or to reject, that is the form of ignorance, moha. The spiritual disease of ego drives us to react to every sensory impression: form, sound, smell, taste, touch, in one of these 3 ways: attraction, repulsion, or confusion, depending on which guise the object appears to us: alluring, disgusting, or bewildering. Although these responses differ in appearance, all 3 are mistaken, for their common cause is the inner sense of self and mine. Thus the sense of self and mine is the gravest contamination, giving rise to all suffering and illness. Because we have not fully grasped the Buddha's teaching on suffering, we do not truly understand what suffering is. We tend to think that suffering refers only to birth, aging, and death. In fact, suffering is not confined to physical pain alone. As the Buddha himself summarized, in brief, suffering is clinging to the aggregates. By aggregates, khanda, the 5 constituents of a person: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, he meant the very elements on which attachment arises, either as subject, I, or as object, mine. When we cling to our body and mind as I, or to them as mine, then birth, aging, sickness, and death become suffering. If body and mind are free from such clinging, they are like those of an arahant, completely untroubled by any suffering. You must clearly recognize that clinging to self and mine is the source of every form of suffering. Wherever clinging exists, their ignorance and confusion follow. Our unclarity arises because our mind is not empty. It is filled with anger, irritation, and turmoil, the very states engendered by the poisons of self and mind. Conversely, a mind freed from all clinging is filled with clear insight, panna, wisdom, mindfulness, or awakening. We must understand that 2 opposing mental tendencies exist: clinging to self and mine, ignorance, and clear, discerning awareness, wisdom. They are mutually exclusive. When one is present, the other cannot enter. A mind filled with self-clinging cannot harbor insight. When insight arises, self-clinging vanishes. To be free of self and mind is to attain pure awareness, mindfulness, wisdom, or awakening. Emptiness here and now. To grasp Dhamma precisely, consider the Zen master Huangpo's words. Emptiness is Dhamma, emptiness is the Buddha, emptiness is primordial mind. Confusion and the absence of emptiness are neither Dhamma, nor the Buddha, nor primordial mind. This pithy statement captures the entirety of Buddhist teaching from Theravada through Mahayana. Without absolute realization of emptiness, complete uprooting of self and mind, one can only see reality but not fully merge with it. Therefore, one should not confine Buddhisa's thought to the Theravada domain alone. Confusion, ignorance, and the loss of emptiness are subsequent developments. Primordial mind or Buddha nature is innate. Confusion and ignorance arise later when self and mind take hold, obscuring Buddha nature and emptiness. In short, two opposite tendencies arise: the awareness of Dhamma and emptiness, and its antithesis, confusion and loss of emptiness. When one penetrates both, understanding Dhamma becomes easy. If you sit here as empty, endeavoring not to generate self-clinging or mind-clinging, you will listen with clear, alert awareness, as though self and mind exert no pull on you. However, if something suddenly grabs our attention, one of our senses is stirred, for example, seeing the person beside us move, feeling the arm of the person behind us touch our back, smelling someone's sweat or perfume, or hearing a sound outside. Instantly the sense of I and mine arises in us, and the emptiness or clear awareness we had immediately vanishes. Were we truly empty of self-centeredness, we would no longer experience any sense of I or mine. We would abide in clear awareness, wisdom, which alone eradicates dukkha and brings an end to spiritual disease. From that moment on, no new afflictions can enter, and any previously infected ones are expelled. Once caught, they are cast out. Henceforth, the mind overflows with Dhamma. This accords perfectly with saying that emptiness is clear awareness, is Dhamma, is the Buddha. The very moment I and mine are emptied, the highest qualities of the Buddha's teaching all manifest. Simply put, it is perfect mindfulness combined with comprehensive understanding of all phenomena, wisdom, together with a genuine sense of moral shame, hiri, a heartfelt regret for one's wrongdoing, and honest compassion that fears evil, ottappa. A blend of patience and perseverance, khanti, a kindly benevolence, saraka, that shrinks from causing harm, steadfast gratitude, katanakatavati, and an unwavering integrity ready to face any challenge. These qualities yield a clear, transparent seeing of reality and bring about nibbana, supreme awakening. The aid of virtue. All these fundamental qualities must be present, for they too belong to Dhamma: clear comprehending awareness, sadasampajana, moral shame, hiri, fear of wrongdoing, ottappa, patience and fortitude, khanti, loving-kindness, saraka, and gratitude, katanakatavati. Even mere shame and fear of evil suffice to bring lasting peace to the world. Today, humanity seems so brazen that few feel shame or fear before their own atrocities. They commit unforgivable acts and, even knowing the catastrophic harm they wreak upon the world, persist nonetheless. The world is ravaged simply because so few retain these basic virtues: shame and fear of wrongdoing, as Buddhadasa observed half a century ago. Consider another, even humbler virtue: gratitude. This single quality alone suffices to bring peace to the world. Gratitude helps us realize that every being, not just humans, benefits others. Cats, dogs, sparrows all confer some benefit. If we cultivate grateful awareness of our debt to all beings, we lack the courage to harm or mistreat any of them. Simply by harnessing gratitude, we contribute significantly to healing the world. In sum, when rightly practiced, these virtues collectively called morality share the same essence: the power to serve and uplift the world. Conversely, false or hypocritical morality breeds chaos, conflict, and confrontation. But when true morality shines forth freed from I and mine, the full integrity of Dhamma, of the Buddha, and of all phenomena arises within that single, primordial mind. What Buddhadasa describes here parallels the Mahayana concept of Buddha nature and the Zen ideal of merging with reality. Once you penetrate the core of Dhamma, you transcend all labels, doctrines, and sections. By contrast, a mind incessantly expressing I and mine in a state of tension can never embody any true virtue. Such a mind is restless, negligent, incapable of sustained insight, lacking discernment and balance. It knows neither shame nor fear of wrongdoing. Such a person's mind is wholly consumed by the darkness of ignorance, driving acts of destruction upon the world. For one in that condition, no discussion of impermanence, suffering, non-self, or anything else can help. Their case is hopeless.